Butt welding or lap welding, which is better? Today, we're going to end the debate once and for all. Regular viewers of the channel already know where I stand on the subject. So, under all the snow here, we have the remains of a 1930 Ford Model A. This started life as a four-door sedan. It's been cut down into a truck. But if we look inside here, we can see this factory butt weld seam goes the full height of the rear body panel on both sides. Here's how that seam looks like on the outside. There's no filler on this, and there's barely any paint left at all, but that seam is still holding up strong after 95 years. Here's what a factory lap weld on an exterior panel looks like with the lead removed. You can see it was spot welded together. There's a channel or an indent here, and that trough was filled over with lead. This panel slides underneath this panel. This panel's over top. Here we have the same lap weld on a Chevy truck cowl as the one inside, but this still has the lead in it. If you look closely here, we can actually see rust starting to come through from below that seam. And if we had melted out all the lead here, I guarantee there would be rust all through here along this lap weld. Here we have another seam on the A-pillar. This has been lap welded, beaten down, and filled with lead. And we can see that the lead is starting to bubble up and lift, and it's cracking. So there is rust under this seam. The seam has failed. That crack there, you can see that, means that it is rusting out underneath the lead. There's a lot of rust under here. This is where the crack was, and you can see all the rust there. Here's another lap welded seam on a 1977 Chevelle. This seam is holding up relatively well. This is how quarter panels on cars in the 60s and 70s were joined. They were lap welded here to the roof and then filled with lead. If you actually look at the light line, you can spot this seam. There's definitely a noticeable wave in the finish. Other than that, it is holding up reasonably well, all things considered. On the passenger side of the same car here, we have a different story. This quarter panel was actually changed by a body shop when this car was only a few years old. However, the factory lead seam here is still intact. What they did is they joined the quarter panel in through here, and they joined it by lap welding it, beating it down, and then filling it with plastic body filler instead of lead. And I think we can all agree that this repair has failed. This is the way that things were done by body shops 40, 50 years ago. This was considered acceptable, and this would have been a good repair at the time, but you can see it has not stood the test of time very well. Here's a look from inside the trunk here, and we can see that lap welded seam that was done by the body shop. And again, by the standards of the time, this was actually a good repair. You can see that they actually did try and seal it up from the backside. But regardless of all that, the seam still has failed. Of course, the quarter panel still hasn't fallen off yet. So structurally, yes. Cosmetically, failure. The one convenient thing about plastic body filler is that it usually fails before the metal underneath completely disintegrates. Lead can be deceiving because lead won't rust, and it's quite a bit stronger than plastic body filler. So it's very common on these factory lead seams. Once you melt the lead out, there's usually rust under there, and sometimes all the metal below is actually completely gone. If you guys watch Cold War Motors and you watched Scott and Jim melt the lead out of Jim's 56 Continental, there was several areas where the lead was intact, it looked fine, but when they melted it out, huge rust hole underneath. Those are those factory lap welded seams. They rusted out, the lead stayed intact, and you wouldn't have known it, but there's a hole underneath. Here's a 1935 Chevy Master. This was the first year for any car to have a all steel roof, and this roof was lap welded onto the lower A-pillar right here. And if we look closely, you can see this crack here, and I don't know if it's going to show up on camera or not. There's another crack right here. Again, this was lap welded here, beaten down fairly severely, and then filled with lead. And now, if we melted this lead out, there would be rust under here, which is what's causing this lead to crack. And how bad is it? I don't know, and I don't really care to find out. Here's the same 1935 Chevy, and we have another factory seam going through here, where this lower side panel was joined into the upper back window and trunk area. And we can see the factory lead seam here, where this was lap welded again. And once again, it's cracking, which again means that there's going to be rust forming in this lap welded seam. Here we have a 1936 Chevy truck. Here's a look at a factory butt weld on the 1936 from inside the cab. Here's how that seam looks like from the outside. There's no evidence at all of there being a butt weld here. This seam was hand finished at the factory, metal finished. There's no lead in it. If you look on the inside closely, you can still see marks where they had pick and filed out a low spot. Here's a factory lap weld on the A-pillar here. And you can see it hasn't fared as well. The seam was filled with lead, and now it is rusting and causing the lead to crack and lift. This is actually the good side. The other side, the lead is completely fallen out. Here's a look at a factory butt weld on the inside of a 1949 Cadillac quarter panel. This butt weld extends this entire seam and goes up into here. Here we can see that seam from the outside. This seam at the factory was butt welded, metal finished by hand. There's no lead in any of this. It was all hand finished right below the paint, and it has survived. Now this panel spent at least 50 years sitting outside, rotting in a junkyard, yet here it is over 70 years later, still intact. Here's that same style of seam on a 1953 Chevy quarter panel. You can see, however, instead of butt welding it, they have a flange, and it's been lap welded. On the outside, that seam was filled with lead and filed smooth, and it's actually holding up well at the top here. However, down at the bottom, where moisture can get into that lap weld, we can see that it's started to crack and fail. So why did the factories use lap welding then? Why are they still using it on today's cars? One simple answer is cost. That's all it really is. You have to keep in mind, none of these vehicles were ever meant to last more than 5 years. They're still not meant to last more than 5 years. If a vehicle lasted forever, you'd never need to buy a new one, and the factories would go out of business. Now, from the 1980s onwards, this factory lap welded seam that was filled started to disappear. However, cars still use lap welding today. Nowadays, pretty much every car, the entire side is stamped in one piece, and then the roof is a separate piece, and they are lap welded through here. And the seam is not filled, it's covered with some kind of plastic molding from front to back. Again, the motivation behind that was cost and also ease of repairability. These factory seams on these older cars had to be hand filled and hand finished, whereas today, everything can be done with robots. Also, when a car comes into a body shop and it needs painting on the roof or painting on the quarter panel, they don't have to blend in the middle of the panel. They can simply mask off at that lap welded seam, either paint the roof or paint the quarter panel. It's much easier and leads to much more invisible repair. And even with all the seam sealing and all the corrosion protection and all the fancy coatings on new cars, they still rust out after 5 years, and guess where they all start rusting? Right at those lap welds. Not necessarily on the roof, but everywhere there's a lap weld in the lower portion of the body, anywhere that's going to be getting exposed to salt and moisture, that's the first place that's going to start rusting on you. The problem with butt welding is that it's not as user-friendly for beginners as lap welding might be. The good news is that it is a learnable skill. All of this is a learnable skill. Nobody was born being good at welding. Humans were not evolved or whatever to instantly be good at welding. If you can practice, you can get good at butt welding, and you can make an invisible repair by using butt welding. But let's take a look at a few common reasons why a butt welded repair might fail. Now, for our intents and purposes, we are going to be using a MIG welder. Personally, I prefer using a TIG welder where possible for all butt welded sheet metal repairs. Again, where possible. A lot of the issues that I will show you here can be avoided by TIG welding. But again, TIG welding is a skill that has to be learned. It's more difficult to learn than MIG welding, and most people have a MIG welder. So that's why we're showing the MIG welder. This is what I would call an acceptable MIG welded seam on sheet metal. It's not very pretty, but we can see we have maximum penetration on the backside. This weld will last a long time. It isn't the prettiest of things, but that's not as important as a solid repair. Also, we could keep the heat down a little bit. It is a little hot, but I would rather have a little hot than too cold. Speaking of too cold, here's an example of a weld that is too cold. You can see that it's very ropey, and when we look at the backside, it hasn't actually joined the two pieces of metal together. All it has done is bridged across. We can still see the line clear as day, and I guarantee you, if we ground this off, this weld would simply crack and fall apart because, again, it's all on the surface. Here's another example of what I would say is an acceptable butt welded seam with the MIG. Again, it's not very pretty. I turned the heat down a little bit compared to our first example. We still do have good penetration on the backside. I'd like to see maybe a little bit more in a couple places, but overall, this would hold a car together and last a long time. There is, however, one potential problem with this seam. And once we're done looking at these samples, we're going to go over to the grinder and we're going to grind this down, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now, here's a problem that we probably all run into. The problem here is trying to weld a gap that is too big. Now, there's two schools of thought when it comes to MIG welding. Some people say you need a gap, others don't. I'm on the side, no gap, or as tight as possible, maybe like this here. You can see there's a very, very slight, it's not even the same thickness as the metal, but this would be okay. This gap is almost 3/16 of an inch, and it is way too big to try and weld. I also don't like those butt weld clamps. I think they're kind of a square with a wing nut on them. I'll put a picture up. I don't like using those. They leave too much gap, in my opinion, and you can start running into trouble. So we were able to weld this gap. However, look at the backside. Looks like a porcupine. So the reason that this repair is going to fail, you see all these little porcupine thingies here? Well, that is just like an entry trail for rust to get into your weld. And you're going to have the rust starts here and it just creeps its way in, and it will cause that seam to rust from the backside. Not only that, but whenever you're trying to weld a large gap like this, it's very difficult to get the thing fully sealed up. And a lot of times you end up with little pinholes. I don't know, can you see that there? You'll end up with pinholes, and then you can go back and touch them up, but then you're putting more heat in the panel, and it's very difficult to get all of them. One trick is you can shine a flashlight in there. The trouble is, welding, grinding, welding, grinding, welding, grinding, more heat, more chance that that panel is going to warp on you, which is another issue with any kind of welding. This last example here is what happens when you try welding to a dirty, contaminated surface. In this case, we're welding to rust, welding to paint. Not only that, but the gas is not on. So we have very, very porous weld. And I don't know if it's going to show up or not, but you can see there's pinholes in that weld. This weld has almost no strength. And there's also, again, the pinholes, which are going to allow moisture to get in from the backside and destroy whatever you put over top of this to finish it out, your paints, your primers, your body fillers. It's just going to act as a wick for that moisture to get in and cause your seam to fail. So always make sure you're welding to good, clean metal, paint off, rust off. Make sure you've got your gas on. Believe it or not, I have seen that happen where guys have welded for almost a whole day without turning the gas on. So this can also happen if you're welding next to a fan or a heater, or trying to weld with the garage door open and it's windy out. Anything that will blow your gas away can cause this effect, and that is a big no-no. So we got our welding done and we're happy with it. Now we're going to move on to grinding it, and I'm going to show you a couple of mistakes that happen during the grinding stage that can cause your weld seam to fail. So I've ground down this weld here, and you can see that my grinding wheel is just starting to touch the metal, but you can obviously clearly see this side of the panel, the weld is now almost flush, whereas on this side of the panel, there's still a step, and here's where the mistake gets made. So what's happened here is that I was not very careful when I tack welded this panel. Again, I like to tack weld them every 1 inch to hold everything in place. What I try to do is I try to make sure both layers are on the same plane. Now, in this case, we have one, I can't really do this with one hand, but one piece of metal is slightly higher. This side is higher than this side, creating this step here. The way we could have avoided this is by spending more time fitting these two halves together, making sure they were both flush, but we didn't do that. So what do we do now? Well, believe it or not, there's actually nothing wrong with this, even though it's not the prettiest of repairs. What we would do next is maybe do a little bit of hammer and dolly work if there's some distortion or warpage or whatever, and then we would clean this really well, and then we would go straight to body work, put our filler over it, block sand it, and then prime, paint, whatever. What we don't want to do when we see this happen is we don't want to try and make it completely disappear. Oh great, look at that. We've managed to make our weld disappear. We've metal finished it. Well, we've actually metal ruined it. What's happened here is because this side is higher than this side and we've gone and ground it. Now, the metal on this side of the repair has been substantially thinned. And we don't want to thin the metal because we were just replacing thin metal from rust or whatever damage that we were replacing. So, we've just added damage back into the panel. Actually, I don't know if you can see that, but I was able to just about poke a hole right through this side with this screwdriver here, because that is how thin this is. So that's not very good. There again, look at that. We go over here, I can't poke it, but over here, the metal is so thin, I bet you we could almost just, yep, look at that. Just about all the way through. So that's not good. The other thing I've seen folks do when they have this type of situation is they'll go back in and they'll add more weld on this side and then grind it, add more weld and grind it until this disappears. Well, there is a bit of a problem with that, and the problem is that every time we weld something, the heat from that welding is going to cause the metal in this area around the weld, and the weld itself is going to shrink, which is causing damage to the panel. That's where your warpage comes from. So the more you weld on it, the more chance of that panel is going to warp and get away from you. Not only that, but grinding also adds heat to the metal. So welding, grinding, welding, grinding, welding, grinding, it's adding more damage, more chances for that to get away from you. And then yes, you can make it so it disappears and it looks beautiful in bare metal. But because you put so much heat into it, now the panel is going to be dished in, or worse, dished out, and you're going to have a lot more body work to do when it comes time to actually make that disappear. While technically it's not going to cause your repair to fail as long as you're careful when you're grinding, it does mean more body work and more work on your hand for no reason. So when I see this, a little bit of hammer and dolly work, then straight to body work, that's a totally fine repair. With TIG welding, if we run into this, the metal or the weld is soft enough where we can actually hammer and dolly and planish it out so that this disappears. Again, ideally, you still want both layers to be lined up totally flush, but things happen. We're human, so TIG welding can be corrected to some extent. MIG welding, you're kind of stuck with it. The one thing we do have to do before body working something like this is we do need to get in there and we need to clean all this blue off and all of the black, any soot or anything like that around the weld. Depending on how bad it is, sometimes you can just use these paint stripper type wheels and get in there. Sometimes you can use a wire wheel. Sometimes you also have to sandblast it, but you do have to clean all of this out because this can cause your filler to lift. It's not clean there. It's all kind of sooty and whatever. So it does have to, your filler does have to go over good clean metal. Now, some folks like to use a belt sander for grinding down their weld, and that's totally fine, but I have seen these abused as well, because whenever we're grinding a weld, we only want to grind the weld. We don't want to grind the surrounding metal. So I prefer using these Rolock style discs or any style grinding disc because it tells me right away when I've gone too far. The problem with these belt sanders is you can go right on the weld, but it's very easy to dig a trough into the weld, which means you're actually taking away the weld as well. Yes, you're only grinding the weld, but you're taking that away and creating a valley there, which is again going to weaken that joint. And I have seen where it happened multiple times where a guy welded on a panel, used one of these, ground it with this too heavily, and then the panel kept cracking. He had to keep redoing it, and it was a huge disaster. So if anything, grinding is more important than the welding itself because you can do an extreme amount of damage with a grinder. This is thin sheet metal, and it doesn't take much to thin it out to the point where it's now unrepairable. So what's better, butt welding or lap welding? Well, general rule of thumb is if it was lap welded at the factory, then it gets lap welded. If I'm going somewhere through the middle of a panel where there was no seam before, a butt weld is the best way to make for an invisible repair. Now, I've been doing bodywork for 13 years now, and I'm still learning every day. But at every shop that I have worked at, that has been the policy. Lap weld where the factory does, butt weld if we're joining something in at an area that's not factory. And the reason for that is, again, it allows for an invisible repair. The butt weld also allows for better corrosion protection. That means that with a lap joint, it's difficult to tell whether or not the epoxy and the wax oil has actually made its way into that seam. So it is an area where moisture can collect, and if that's the way the factory did it, well, we just have to do the best we can. But if it's a non-factory seam, then we typically go towards the invisible repair. The other thing with the butt weld is that anytime you weld a panel, whether it's lap welded or butt welded, there's always going to be that shrinkage from the heat from welding. And yes, you can control it, but what happens when it gets out of control? Well, with a butt weld, we have full access to get in and hammer and dolly and correct that shrinkage. And I have lots of videos showing how to fix that on my channel. If you don't believe me, we can weld something this long, and I've done it in several videos in the past where we weld a big long seam, intentionally destroy it, and then I show you how you can correct that. So it is possible. Again, a learned skill. Just do a quick sweep across the weld seam here for you. The problem with the lap weld is that if that panel starts to warp on you and get away from you, you have two layers there, which is stronger than the original metal, and so there's no way to hammer that out and to correct that damage from the welding. So you're kind of stuck with whatever you get, and that's when you have to start beating it in and filling it and then hoping that it doesn't ghost through the paint. And lap welding also isn't always going to be faster. An example of that is I once worked with a fellow at a body shop, and he was changing a quarter panel on a modern car, and he lectured me that you cannot butt weld something because you'll warp it. So he proceeded to lap weld the new quarter panel over top of the old quarter panel. He cut the quarter panel here and then lap welded it here and then beat it in. And long story short, 3 days later, he had filler going from here all the way down to here. And then he went to put the door on, and the door didn't fit because the tolerances on a newer car are very, very tight, and you can't have things overlapping. It can, a 16th here and a 16th there adds up very quickly. So then he proceeded to weld a bunch of tabs all along the quarter panel and tried to pull it to get his door gap back. And then he ripped a bunch of holes in the panel by pulling on it. And then he filled the holes with fiberglass. And long story short, the guy got fired for taking way too long to change a quarter panel. Now, with the technicalities out of the way, we also have to consider, well, what's right for you? What's right for the car? Controversial reality here, 99% of cars are not worth restoring properly. Fact is, you're never going to get your money back out of it. So do you want to drive the thing, or do you want to spend 20 years of your life painstakingly trying to make every part of it perfect and every seam disappear? Again, depends on what the car is. If it's a $1 million Bugatti, probably worth doing it properly. And again, a lot of those old cars that were coach built, they were all butt welded, they were hand built, but a production car was often lap welded because that was faster and easier, and they were just trying to crank them out as fast as possible. I mean, is it worth doing a full rotisserie restoration with beautiful butt welded joints everywhere on your 1977 Chevelle? Even more popular cars, is it really worth ruining your life trying to get everything perfect? Well, in my case, pretty much every car that comes here, it's on its way to the junkyard, and it's just like, this is like the last chance stop before it gets crushed. So I have to use my time wisely and to do the repair that is best for that vehicle in order to save it from being crushed. So it's not uncommon for me, if I have to do a floor pan in something and there's 200-300 hours of welding, I may just lap weld that floor pan in, seam seal both sides, and that's totally fine. Nobody's going to see it. It's strong. And how long does any of this really need to last? That's the other thing. Everybody wants to build their car to last for 1,000,000 years. But, on average, most humans aren't going to make it past 80. If you do, good for you. But, There's life expectancy there. So how old are you? How long are you going to have the car? And what's going to happen to it when you're done with it? Chances are it's probably going to get crushed, bulldozed, parted out, whatever. Maybe it's something special. It'll end up in a museum, but nothing lasts forever. So I prefer not to overthink things. So a lot of times I will do what I have to do to repair a vehicle. I guess the best way for that particular vehicle. You go back a couple months, I fixed up an old police car. That thing was rotten, like rotten bad. Every single patch I did on that was lap welded. All I did was I tack welded it about every half an inch. Just knocked the tack weld down with a grinder, tap down any high spots, fiberglass filler over the seam, regular filler, done, out the door. Even the worst, most horrific repair can and will last a long time if the car is stored and taken care of properly. If it's kept clean, dry, it's not driven in the salt or in the winter, it's not left sitting out in the bush somewhere. You know, even the best restoration, if you dump it out in a field somewhere, it's going to fall apart pretty fast. So again, don't overthink things. It's supposed to be fun. And again, with any repair, the biggest thing is your corrosion protection as well. And again, I'm not into, some guys like to peel the whole car apart right down to nothing, you know, get every last little bit of rust out and put some industrial strength epoxy on it and just go hog wild. And that's what you want to do, that's fine. But again, you know, if the car gets dumped in a field when you're done with it, it's going to fall apart just the same as the car that was hammered together. So it's always a balance of how good you want it. When I'm doing something, I make a point of, you know, making sure that the backside of the weld is coated with something. And then once the car is painted, you can go in they make a special wand and you can coat the inside of all those panels with something like wax oil or fluid film, or you can even use ATF for chainsaw bar oil or make your own concoction. Just anything to get some oil, and the oil will creep into all those seams, including those lap welds, and prevent rust and moisture and stuff from getting in. So that's something to think about as well. If you just leave everything bare, doesn't matter if it's butt welded or lap welded, it's not going to last nearly as long as if it's been treated with something. So to conclude, basically do what's right for you, do what's right for the car. Don't try to knock yourself out going crazy. It is, to me, worthwhile to learn new skills. So I think butt welding is a skill that is worth learning. You can never go wrong with investing in yourself and learning new things. I'm still learning and improving every day. But at the same time, don't knock yourself out. This is supposed to be fun. So if you got some old junker and you're paranoid about trying to get everything perfectly metal finished and butt welded and done right, you know, don't knock yourself out over it. Just do what you got to do to get the thing on the road and get it patched up however way you want and have some fun with it, you know.